SpaceX has scheduled a full week with as many as 30 hours of road and beach closures for Starship and Super Heavy testing, and is working hard to prepare the first orbital-class ship and booster for several major challenges. For a number of reasons, those static fires, and a few additional tests expected to precede them, could be huge milestones for SpaceX's Starship program. For the first time, SpaceX appears to have begun delivering large quantities of cryogenic fluids to Starship's orbital launch pad, still under construction but fast approaching some level of initial operational capability. Sometime in the morning on September 19, a semi-truck carrying a cryogenic liquid nitrogen transport trailer arrived at SpaceX's Starbase launch facilities. Normally, that would be a completely mundane and interesting event. SpaceX has used and will continue to use liquid nitrogen to safely proof test Starship prototypes and supercool their liquid methane and oxygen propellant for the indefinite future. Earlier this month, after rolling Starship S-20 to the launch pad for the second time and installing it on one of two suborbital launch test mounts, SpaceX began the process of installing Raptor engines, again for the second time, on the rocket. As such, the first Starship static fire with any combination of Raptor center and Raptor vacuum engines will be a significant milestone for SpaceX. Eventually, that will likely culminate in the first static fires of a Starship, likely S-20, with all 6 Raptors installed, a test that will effectively qualify that prototype for its first orbital launch attempt. Meanwhile, things are arguably even more complex for Super Heavy. Aside from a single 3-engine static fire completed by Super Heavy Booster4, Starship's first stage has never come close to a full-up static fire, with all 29 to 33 Raptor engines installed. Whenever that occurs, Super Heavy will likely become the most powerful rocket ever tested and, like with Starship, will be more or less qualified for its first flight if the test goes according to plan. The orbital tank farm still well under construction, and at least a few weeks or months from total complete, Starship's orbital launch site tank farm will ultimately be a group of 8 massive storage tanks. Surrounded by thousands of feet of insulated plumbing, industrial pumps, a small army of cryocoolers, a blockhouse filled with human-sized valves, and much more. Said tank farm has been under construction for the better part of 2021, beginning with work on its concrete foundation this January. 9 months later, the orbital tank farm is nearly complete. A power distribution and communications blockhouse has been complete for weeks, with virtually all the wiring and cabling needed for the orbital launch mount and tower already in place. Several hundred feet of concrete cable and plumbing conduit have been filled with thousands of feet of wires, cables, and pipes and been sealed and buried. The tank farm blockhouse, where a dozen or so massive valves control the flow of propellant to and from the orbital launch mount and tower, is complete save for some final plumbing. Finally, 7 of 8 GSE ground support equipment tanks have been installed and partially plumbed. Built in the same factory, 6 are virtually identical to Starship and Super Heavy tanks, and will store LOX 3X, LN2, 2X, LCH4, 2X, and around 1 million gallons of water. Additionally, to insulate those 7 thin, steel storage tanks, SpaceX has contracted with a water storage tank company to build 7 cryoshells and said million-gallon water tank. The water tank was installed months ago, and all 7 shells are completed and ready to go as of last month. Only 2 of those 7 cryoshells have been installed, and, rather asymmetrically, both on LOX tanks. At the moment, that's one of the biggest points of uncertainty standing between SpaceX and the ability to test Super Heavy or Starship at the orbital launch site. It's entirely unclear if uninsulated GSE tanks can support any kind of substantial testing, like, say, the first full Super Heavy static fire test campaign, before their contents effectively boil off. By all appearances the first time that the farm's actual main tanks have been filled with anything, that liquid nitrogen seems to have been loaded into one or both of the 2 insulated LOX tanks. There are 2 or 3 main explanations. First, SpaceX could simply be testing those more or less completed tanks with their first cryogenic fluids. Those partial, cryo-proof tests would also help clean and flush out the interior of the LOX tanks, removing mundane debris or contamination that could become a major hazard when submerged in a high-density oxidizer. Given that both tanks can easily hold approximately 1,300 tons, approximately 2.9 mlb of liquid nitrogen, 70 tons is more of a tickle than a test, though, so a magnitude more would need to be delivered to perform, even a half-decent bare minimum cryoproof. The other distinct possibility is that SpaceX plans to temporarily use one or both of the only two finished orbital pad tanks to store liquid nitrogen for Super Heavy Booster4's first cryogenic proof test. Either way, SpaceX has test windows scheduled every day this week, beginning with a 6-hour window that opens. In a rare sign of material progress, SpaceX and the FAA have finally released what is known as a draft environmental assessment of the company's South Texas Starship launch plans. Set to be the largest and most powerful rocket in spaceflight history, when it first begins orbital launches, the process of acquiring permission to launch Starship and its Super Heavy booster out of the wetlands of the South Texas coast was never going to be easy. The Boca Chica site SpaceX ultimately settled on for its first private launch facilities, initially meant for Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy, but later dedicated to BFR, now Starship, is simultaneously surrounded by sensitive coastal habitats. Populated by several threatened or endangered species, and situated mere miles as the crow flies from a city whose temporary population oscillates from a few thousand to tens of thousands. Reception and analysis of the draft and its timing have been mixed. On one hand, SpaceX's draft EA, completed with oversight from the FAA and help from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, gives a number of reasons for optimism. In a sign that SpaceX is taking a pragmatic approach to the inevitable environmental review and launch license approval hurdles standing in front of orbital South Texas Starship launches. The company has actually pursued what is known as a programmatic environmental assessment. Most importantly, that means that SpaceX's Starbase Programmatic Environmental Assessment, if approved, will be more like a foundation or stepping stone that should make it easier to start small and methodically expand the scope and nature of the company's plans for Boca Chica. Along those lines, as part of Starbase's first dedicated environmental assessment, SpaceX has proposed a maximum of 23 flight operations annually. While Starship is still in the development phase, including up to 20 suborbital Starship test flights, and 3 orbital launches or Super Heavy hops. Once SpaceX has worked out enough kinks for slightly more confident Starship operations, the company would enter an operational phase that would allow for as many as 5 suborbital Starship launches, and 5 orbital Starship launches, as well as ship and booster landings back on land after all 10 possible launches. In other words, SpaceX's initial draft programmatic environmental assessment is extremely conservative, requesting permission for what amounts to a bare minimum concept of operations for orbital Starship launches. However, as an example, a 5-launch maximum would almost entirely prevent SpaceX from launching Starship to Mars, the Moon, and maybe even high-energy Earth orbits, without using all of its annual launch allotments on a single mission. Thanks for watching this video, and it's a super interesting topic. If you like this, make sure to subscribe. If you have any crazy ideas about what we should cover in next video, please comment it below, and we'll see if we can get to it. So thanks again for watching and goodbye.